This brings us to two topics in need of clarification with respect to the measurement of time within halakha. One is the concept of the halachic hour. The other is the time period of BEIN HaSHEMASHOT. In both of the examples mentioned previously, the unit of measure for time is the sha'ah, sha'ot in plural. To Rabbi Eliezer, mitzvat kriyat shema of the nighttime must be done before the end of the 4th hour. The Chachamim disagree and maintain that it may be said up until midnight. As we shall soon see, the word sha'ah is not the hour that we use in day-to-day life. Similarly, the Mishnah refers to the time periods, both Torah law and rabbinical law, in which chametz may not be consumed and or even have benefit from in terms of hours of the day. In day-to-day life, the smallest unit of time used by society is the second. 60 of those seconds comprise a minute, 60 of those minutes, or 3,600 seconds, comprise an hour, because nowadays we have the tools to measure that unit of time. Keeping in mind, however, that the mechanical clock, the forerunner of all the various clocks that now in use, did not come into being until the 8th century. Prior to that, there was no way of measuring a second, which would have posed a challenge to those who abided by the restrictions of the consumption of chametz as to how they would distinguish and identify the 6th hour of Erev Pesach, 11 to 12 in our terminology, and the 5th hour, for which Rabbi Meir maintained that the consumption of chametz was permissible, and to Rabbi Yehuda it was prohibited. Which brings me to the topic of the halachic hour, the sha'ot mentioned in Tanaic literature. Aside from the fact that there was no way of measuring a second, which could measure the minute, which could allow an individual to calculate an hour, there was another problem that needed to be addressed. Way back then, and most probably up until the 8th century when the mechanical clock was invented, Yom was defined as the period of sunrise to sunset. This would also be the case for people involved in work, usually farming, and animal husbandry. The problem with this is that the length of daylight kept changing. As for example, in the southern hemisphere, there would only be 9 hours and 32 minutes of daylight hours, whereas 6 months later, you would have 14 hours and 47 minutes of daylight hours. In the northern hemisphere, this would be reversed. Midday would be 12:22 p.m. and 1:19 p.m. respectively. So the question to be answered is, how do they calculate the 4th hour, the 5th hour, midday or midnight before the invention of the mechanical clock? Which brings us to the concept of the halachic hour. What was done was to divide the daylight hours into 12 periods. These periods were called sha'ot. In June, in the southern hemisphere, each of the sha'ot would be the equivalent of nowadays 47 minutes. In December, each of the sha'ot would be the equivalent of 73 minutes, which meant there needed to be a recalculation of the sha'ot for virtually every day of the year. What is shown here that the end of the 4th hour as being 10 o'clock is built on the assumption and applies to a day that begins at 6 a.m. and sunset is at 6 p.m. Similarly, the midnight at 12 applies to the same assumption. And by the same token, even though Rabban Gamliel maintains that the evening Shema can be said any time from sunset to sunrise, the period will change each day throughout the year depending on the times of sunrise and sunset. Nowadays, we can calculate and plot these days based on mathematical calculations to the exact second. And more recently, with the advent of the internet, we have access to the beginning and ending times for any day for the next 100 or so years. The list for important times each day is quite comprehensive. As of September the 10th, 2016, for Melbourne, Australia, nightfall, the Hebrew term Tzeit HaKochavim, when 3 medium-sized stars are visible, indicating the conclusion of Shabbat, is at 6:32 p.m. Note that this is 26 minutes after sunset. However, one defines within halacha the time of sunset. There are some Hasidic groups that maintain that nightfall, or Tzeit HaKochavim, based upon views expressed by the Rishonim, adopt the viewpoint of Rabbeinu Tam that Tzeit HaKochavim is 72 minutes after sunset, which would move the end of Shabbat, in this case, to 7:18 p.m. Similarly, with respect to the mitzvah of Kriyat Shema, it would begin at 6:32 and last either 4, 6, or 12 halachic hours. The earliest time to recite the morning Shema on September the 10th, 2016 was 6:30 a.m. and the period would extend according to the respective number of halachic hours recorded in the Mishnah. Which brings us to the topic of BEIN HaSHEMASHOT. Nighttime does not begin at sunset. In the halachic world, it begins 26, or according to some opinions 72 minutes after sunset, when it is sufficiently dark to see the proverbial 3 stars. There is a similar period of time between the end of night, namely dawn, and the actual sunrise. Daytime hours do not begin at dawn, but do begin at sunrise and end at sunset. In the halachic world, these 2 periods are referred to as BEIN HaSHEMASHOT. In English, twilight, which is the time between dawn and sunrise, or between sunset and dusk. As for example, after the sun has dipped beyond the horizon, but the reflective rays bouncing off the clouds provide a degree of light. This period of twilight can be quantified to the point that in the civil day there are 3 degrees of twilight. Civil twilight, where the top edge of the sun has dipped below the horizon up to 6 degrees, nautical twilight between 6 and 12 degrees, and astronomical twilight from 12 to 18 degrees, with a fairly extensive differential between them, ranging from 11 minutes to 71 minutes to 132 minutes. The various definitions for BEIN HaSHEMASHOT / twilight would possibly explain the Naleket amongst the Rishonim with respect to BEIN HaSHEMASHOT, with the accepted minhag throughout most of the Orthodox world adopting a 26-minute period for BEIN HaSHEMASHOT, and amongst some Hasidic groups adopting the viewpoint of Rabbeinu Tam that Shabbat ends 72 minutes after sunset. An extra buffer is inserted for the beginning of Shabbat, and that is the traditional 18 minutes before sunset, which is the time for Hadlakat Neirot, in this case 5:48 p.m. I will now return to the Sikha, where the Rebbe develops a halachic difference between the way Rashi frames the halacha to that of the Gemara.